So I'll now say a few words about the center, and first also introduce myself. So I'm Lorraine St. Marie. I serve as director of our Providence School of Transformative Leadership and Spirituality, and I also serve in a support role for this Center for Aging and Community, working closely with the co-director in community engagement, who you will meet very soon. The Center for Aging and Community was formally founded in the winter of 2019, following receipt of a gift from a generous donor who was intent on supporting research and community engagement around questions and issues of aging in an aging society. The center's mandate is to promote healthy aging through the optimization of the quality of life and community resources for older adults. So through innovation, collaboration, and interdisciplinary research, the center seeks to address challenges and facilitate opportunities in all realms of daily life, including the social, the physical, the cognitive, the emotional, the spiritual, as well as the political spheres. And in today's presentation, we'll have access to some of those spheres that will be presented. The intention of the center is twofold. As a center of research, its purpose is to promote and advance research on issues related to aging from a number of perspectives and disciplines. As a center for community engagement, its purpose is to create spaces for raising awareness, engagement in meaningful dialogue, and inspiring effective action in response to specific concerns in an aging society. The center, therefore, aims to strengthen the connections between research and the community. And it's done in two ways, in a number of ways, two of which I'm going to mention today. The first is about granting student awards for research on the issue of aging and community through the annual Thomas G. Feeney QC Award. This is the award that Andrea Khalid then is the winner of. Its second way is community member participation in the research itself and feedback in the community. And so if you are interested in participating in the research, I'm going to give you actually a form at the end where you can actually indicate an interest in that so that we will keep a record of that. So I now invite Patricia Marsden-Dole, co-founder and co-director of the Center for Aging and Community, to say a few words. Following Andrea's presentation and our discussion, we will then be hearing a few words from our co-director of research. And so as I now pass this on to Patricia, I just want to say a few words about her. She is a graduate of the doctorate in practical theology here in St. Paul University. And this center is a concrete outcome of her research that examined the problematic dynamics of an aging society and explored ways to inspire and motivate boomers to engage and serve the needs of the aging population. So with this now, I'll hand this over to Patricia. Patricia, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you, Lorraine. And again, congratulations to Andrea for her successful project, which does engage the community. And that is in something which we see with a large growing aging population, the whole caregiving aspect of it, and a lot of it being done by outside of the sort of the long-term care facility world, which is another one which engages all of us. Anyway, I just want to say something very briefly about the Thomas G. Feeney Award. Thomas G. Feeney was the Dean of the University of Ottawa Law School, and following his retirement from there, he came over to St. Paul University, where he did work on canon law. I'm not sure whether he got the doctorate or not, but that was his retirement project, as was my retirement project. I'm hoping that his son, Greg Feeney, may come in sometime to listen to us. But his son-in-law, Wayne McKinnon, was the one who gave us a very substantial grant to begin this important center. So with that, I hand it back to Lorraine. I think you're managing the agenda, who will then hand it over to Andrea. So thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you. And all right, I'll now then open the space then for Andrea to do her presentation. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I very much appreciate the award. This gives me an opportunity to provide some information about my passion in working with this particular population. So I will just actually take this opportunity to share my screen so that everybody can view this in the way, let's see if this works. Okay. All right, so does this work? Does everybody see what I'm seeing? Good, okay. So we will just get started. So again, in terms of my presentation today, the topic is promoting resiliency. So the effects of Parkinson's disease on caregiver and care partners. Let's see. Okay, so in terms of the topics that are going to be covered within this presentation, I'm going to speak a little bit about the reasons for my research interest with this particular population, so the caregivers and care partner population. I'll briefly review the literature. I will also talk a little bit about resiliency, as well as my proposed research. So in terms of where I sort of began really becoming more and more interested in working with this particular population, before my clinical life, I worked in neuropsychology and assessment, and I was working at Briere Continuing Care here in Ottawa for just over 10 years. I was working in the geriatric rehab program as well as the memory program. And on top of that, I was also working from a clinical trials perspective with Briere Continuing Care for about 15 years, working with clients who are experiencing dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And I was also working with the caregiver assessments. So this actually propelled into my clinical work. And I knew when I started private practice a number of years ago that this was certainly a population that I wanted to work with. It was going to be a part of my specialization. So again, as a registered psychotherapist in clinical practice, I see clients who are current caregivers or care partners working specifically with these long-term neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease. And then in doing so, I think what is very important is to identify the gaps in the literature and how to progress clinical practice for this population. So in terms of the impacts on caregivers and care partners, currently right now, there are over 100,000 Canadians who are living with Parkinson's disease, and thousands of new cases are being diagnosed annually. It is the third highest neurological health cost in Canada. So this comes in behind epilepsy and Alzheimer's disease, dementia. Now, an important note to make is that 40% of those living with Parkinson's disease are being cared for by their significant other. So while over 100,000 Canadians are living with Parkinson's disease, there's a significant amount of people that are impacted just in the caring for these people, and it happens to be their significant others. More recently, so within the past decade, researchers have really begun to start looking at, to investigate the impacts of Parkinson's disease on informal caregivers, so that being the caregivers or care partners. This is very interesting because we all know how much Parkinson's disease has an impact on the person living with the disease, but we're also really starting to understand the impacts on the caregivers, so those who are caring for them. So in terms of the review in the literature, what we have noted is that caregiver stress doubles when caring for someone with a neurological disorder. And with that, the stress is then compounded if the condition includes cognitive and behavioral issues. So as Parkinson's disease progresses, burden also tends to increase. And it is estimated that about 50 to 80% of those living with Parkinson's disease will develop dementia. When caregiver burden increases, so as does the risk of psychiatric illness. So when caregivers are spending a lot of time caring for their loved ones, what we do notice is that things like depression start creeping in, as well as symptoms of anxiety. And when both of those things are present, it tends to have an impact on their quality of life. So what we're noticing in the research or in the literature is that depression and anxiety have a direct correlation with quality of life. And when those things are present, there tends to be a lower quality of life documented by care partners. Another important note is that care partners do tend to neglect their own needs while caring for their loved one. So in terms of nutrition, so they aren't necessarily eating as well as they used to, or as well as they could. Sleep is immensely affected. And when we're dealing with neurological disorders, one of the things that is quite significantly impacted is sleep. So when our partners who we're caring for are not sleeping through the night, neither are the caregivers. So this is an important piece. And also they are not as attentive to their own healthcare needs. So they are not necessarily making the appointments that they need. They are not following up with concerns that they may have with their family doctors or specialists. So when they are so enthralled in taking care of their partners, they tend to neglect their own needs. And in doing so, this affects their well-being. So given the longevity of Parkinson's disease for a large number of people living with Parkinson's, the duration of caring and the severity of the fatigue is also going to have an impact on these psychiatric issues that we're noticing. So again, the symptoms of anxiety as well as symptoms of depression. So when we talk about, again, the recommendations that the literature has provided us with, some of the main themes tend to be addressing the needs of caregivers and care partners. So figuring out what the needs are and how to address them. They recommend finding ways to improve quality of life, finding ways to decrease caregiver burden, and also addressing what type of clinical implications and interventions can we use in order to address the challenges that caregivers are being provided with or being faced with. So resilience is a big topic these days. So it's very much a buzzword. We talk about it quite a bit from a clinical perspective. And it's important to really identify what it is. So how is it a part of our lives and how can we maintain resilience or improve it? So according to the American Psychological Association, it is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family or relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. So the role of resilience in one's life is to also be able to acknowledge the things that are within our control. So when we tend to focus on things that are outside of our control, we start to experience, again, more symptoms of anxiety, potentially some negative thinking. So a piece of resilience is really to ensure that we're focusing on things that are within our control. So how we might be able to respond to something. So for example, with this particular population, if one tends to focus on the disease itself, we don't have much control over that. What we do have control over is how we're responding to the disease and how we're responding to the situation that we're being put in. So it does not mean that those who are resilient don't experience difficulties or challenging times. In fact, those who do describe themselves as being resilient often have experienced emotional pain and stress throughout their lives. So when we talk about aspects of resilience, so becoming more resilient can increase one's ability to get through difficult circumstances, difficult situations, challenges that we're faced with. It also empowers growth and tends to improve one's life. So for example, if we were looking at difficult circumstances, a very challenging situation that we're faced with, that is not necessarily in our control, we have to learn to adapt to the situation. So how are we going to respond to the situation? In doing so, we have to tap into the strengths that we have. So what are the strengths? What are the ways in which I can look at this? What do I know that I can experience in a more effective way to get me through this challenging situation, which then, of course, would lead to personal growth. So once we identify our strengths, once we identify what we can control, we find this way of becoming more resilient. So it's not necessarily focusing on the things that are outside of our control, but it's focusing on what we can control. So how we can respond to something in a way that's going to promote our personal growth. So how can improving resilience really help? So given Parkinson's disease as a chronic long-term illness, which has a lasting impact on the person living with Parkinson's disease, it has an equally important impact on their care partners. So if we were to improve our resilience, we would expect that getting through this process, starting earlier in the stages of the disease, would help promote resilience and well-being and a better quality of life for care partners. So improving caregiver and care partner resilience may help improve the quality of life and decrease caregiver burden. And a systematic review and meta-analysis of resiliency training actually proved that participants who were introduced to specific goals and skills that were more likely to be able to treat more common mental health concerns such as depression and anxiety. And what the research also did suggest was these clinical interventions, these clinical strategies that can be used for improving resilience tended to be most commonly associated with cognitive behavioral therapy as well as mindfulness. So I thought I would just kind of introduce this notion of cognitive behavioral therapy, so CBT. I myself in clinical practice utilize this with clients. This is what I'm trained in. So what the cognitive model really suggests is that there's always a situation, and we have these automatic thoughts and images that are associated. And then we have our emotional responses, our behavioral responses, and our physiological responses. So what the cognitive model suggests is the situation often cannot be changed. So in a way, in order to address our behaviors and our emotional responses, we really have to identify what thoughts are influencing such. So this is where CBT comes into play, where addressing our thinking patterns is going to have a direct influence on how we behave and how we feel about something. So again, if you take a look at the diagram here, so it's very much a cycle. So our thoughts create feelings. Feelings then create our behaviors, and in turn, behaviors reinforce our thoughts. So if we can start to understand the influence our thoughts have on our behaviors and emotions, this will be quite important in moving forward, in being able to address our unhelpful thinking patterns. So when we can start identifying how we're thinking about things and how much distress we are experiencing after the fact, that's the number one, that's the first thing that we want to work on. So identifying the unhelpful thinking patterns. And then we want to try to find ways in order to balance out our thoughts. So not to sway directly to negative thinking patterns. And then, of course, another thing to remember is that our thoughts are not always facts. So when we tend to be in a negative mindset, so we're dealing with something very challenging, we tend to address everything in a negative way. So identifying the faulty thinking patterns. So recognizing that, hold on a minute, if I think about this in a negative way, is that totally accurate? Am I not able to get through this challenging situation? It's remembering that the way that we think about things are not always the facts. So I thought I would throw in a little bit of mindfulness here, given it is one of the perspectives that is used frequently to enhance or promote resiliency as well. So mindfulness is really a moment-to-moment awareness of one's experience without judgment. So in this sense, mindfulness is a state and not necessarily a trait. So oftentimes people associate mindfulness with meditation and, sitting quietly and really practicing these meditations. But when we're speaking about the day-to-day challenges that one, say a caregiver or a care partner might be challenged with, increasing mindfulness on a day-to-day basis is actually quite reasonable to consider. So becoming more aware and accepting of our emotions and feelings. Becoming more compassionate with ourselves. If we become more self-compassionate, we are becoming more aware of what it is that we're feeling, and finding ways to notice the little things. So how something may taste, how something smells, how something might look, or how something might feel. So the act of being mindful is really being present. So if we can adjust, or at least set aside all of the other thoughts that we're experiencing when it comes to, caring for our partners, or worrying, or the anxious thoughts that are really invading our brains, it would really be essential to find moments throughout the day to be more mindful. So be more present in what it is that we're doing. It doesn't have to be anything incredibly enjoyable. It can literally be, being mindful in the moment where you're washing dishes, or taking a shower, or going for a walk. Just being present in these little moments throughout our day can actually have a major impact on how much anxiety we're feeling, or how many negative thoughts or worried thoughts that we're experiencing throughout the day. So with all of this information, this comes to the proposed research that I'm looking at engaging in. So I would really like to help address the gap in the literature. So by conducting a needs assessment for caregivers and care partners, and in turn, I would be looking at conducting an interventional study to decrease caregiver burden and improve quality of life through building resiliency. So in terms of addressing the gap in the literature, so we already have some really meaningful information. So during the process of caregiving, needs are not being met, and caregivers and care partners are presented with significant challenges. So we must be able to find ways to enhance our resiliency and address the psychological impacts that we're noticing, or that our research is providing us with. So again, we're talking about the symptoms of anxiety and depression and the lower quality of life. So finding ways to address those needs from a clinical perspective would be quite useful. So conducting a needs assessment. So literally tapping into this population and asking them, what are the needs that are not being met, and how can we meet those needs to help you through this process of caregiving? And then as well, we want to be able to find clinical perspectives, clinical strategies that clinicians can use in therapy to help this population. So in terms of my hypothesis for my research, it's really, by addressing caregiver and care partner burden and resiliency with psychotherapy, caregivers will note an improvement in their quality of life. So this is what I'm hoping will happen when I start my research and when I complete it. And with this, it would also be expected that if there is an improvement in quality of life for this population, this clinical intervention may be quite beneficial for other caregiving populations. So in terms of what it is that I'm looking at doing for my research, which again has not begun, I'm hoping to start it in the spring, I would be looking at specific participants. So this would mean spouses or significant others of those living with Parkinson's disease. Now, when addressing how to or at what point to provide these interventions, I would expect that early to middle stages of the illness would be most beneficial for the caregiver population. And also ensuring that there's no overlap with psychotherapy. So the people who would be participating in this study would not currently be engaged in psychotherapy outside of the study. Now, the intervention that I'd be looking at using is actually a strengths-based CBT resiliency model. So Christine Podesky and Kathleen Mooney created a 4-step CBT strength-based resiliency model to utilize with clients. So it's a construct that we can utilize in a clinical resilience model, which adheres to personal strengths. So identifying personal strengths with one-on-one consultation. So outside of group settings, what the research has also suggested is that this particular population, so caregivers and care partners who are working with Parkinson's disease, actually benefit quite a bit from one-on-one clinical sessions. So this would be an important piece that I would want to bring to my research. And as well as taking a look at the results. So longitudinal studies would most likely be looking at pre and post results. So utilizing psychometric measures, identifying, depressive symptoms, symptoms of anxiety, resilience, as well as quality of life. So before the intervention and then post-intervention as well. And then, of course, when it comes to the results, when I do have those, they would be provided through my thesis and publications. And of course, at that point, I would be very happy to come back and provide the center with what my results are from this research. And then just briefly in conclusion, research looking at addressing caregiver and care partner needs from a psychotherapy perspective may help to decrease caregiver burden and improve quality of life. Now, implementing therapeutic approaches, which have been useful in addressing anxiety and depression. So again, when we go back to the literature, these are the things, or these are the perspectives and strategies that have been shown to be useful in addressing these common mental health concerns, might be quite useful for several populations. And then again, providing more awareness of caregiver and care partner needs can be very useful for clinicians in planning their therapeutic treatment plans and planning their interventions with this particular population. So I just wanted to say again, thank you very much to the center and to Lorraine and Patricia for allowing me this opportunity to discuss my passion for working with this population and how I hope to bring some clinical awareness to how we can help this population with the struggles and the challenges that they're faced on a day-to-day basis. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for giving us access and insight into your proposed research, which is very much, we can say, in keeping, right, with the concern around caregivers, care partners, but also the impact that it would also have in, we can say, even the larger community as people who are engaged in the caregiving. I'm going to open this up to Stephanie, invite Stephanie, Dr. Stephanie Yamin, who is co-director of the center And also Stephanie, who is also the thesis supervisor for Andrea. So Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea, for a beautiful presentation that fits perfectly with the mandate of the Center for Aging and Community, which is healthy aging through optimization of quality of life and community resources for older adults. And we do this through the community engagement and through research. So as the co-director of the center, I focus on the research arm of the center. And our center brings together researchers from a range of disciplines, including psychology, counseling, philosophy, and medicine. And we do this to explore creative ways, which I think have been presented today, creative ways to examine aging and promote opportunities to enhance healthy aging and well-being. So we work alongside older adults, community organizations, healthcare practitioners, and industry partners to explore strengths and challenges of the experiences of older adults. If you look at our website, you will see that you have the opportunity to participate in research. So just like the research that Andrea is doing, yes, under my supervision, but also under Dr. Cynthia Bilodeau, we're both co-supervising this research. And so if you are interested in participating in this study or other studies, please feel free to sign up, and we will be able to send you information about this study and future upcoming studies. So at this point, following the presentation, maybe we can open it up to questions you might have about Andrea's presentation today.
Well, perhaps I could just intervene here to say something about the burden on the community of caregiving, because as the population ages and as we've seen with the pandemic, care in institutions is not something that one would want, I think, in many instances. And therefore, the burden is going to be on the caregiver, on the one-on-one caregiver, which also engages the community in caring for the caregiver.
Thank you for that, Patricia. Thank you. A good opening. For points of connection with what you have heard from Andrea and questions and comments. Actually, this is an optimal time, is it not, Andrea, also to get feedback, right, from this gathered community, you know, as you are, you know, finalizing or working towards finalizing your proposal. Monique, go ahead.
I couldn't find a little hand. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Before we were formally chatting, I've worked on basically the interface of using Parkinson's between chronic care and palliative care. And that was a while back, but because individuals with Parkinson's do so well for such a long period of time, and then as they decline, require more care, and then when they become sort of end of life, there's actually no room. They're not in institutions most of the time, and the caregivers are at their wits' end. And I did see more recently in the literature, actually, that there is a specific aspect of looking at, let me find here, palliative care and Parkinson's disease caregiver perspectives, which is, anyway, might be interesting for you to look at. Of course, it's a very sort of specific time period, right? But it is interesting that the burden, if we call it that, the partnering of care becomes so intense. And because it was relatively easy at the beginning, there's no understanding of what happens later on. And socially speaking, in terms of policies, there's very little care that's provided at home. Or even when individuals go in institutions, in nursing homes, they do not tend to be specialized in various neurological diseases. And that was one thing that was found also in Europe, was end of life care for a person with Parkinson's was, it wasn't addressed.
Mhm.
So I think that's a really interesting, what you're doing is really interesting and will be really vital for understanding the type of supplemental care. We tend to rely on family caregivers or partners, right?
Yeah.
But at one point, it's you're more than a partner here. You're doing a professional job.
Mhm.
And, Patricia's point is that people do want to age in place. You do not want to go in institutions. However, the care can be so overwhelming. You do need some type of institutional care. So my question is, how can we make it more appealing? How can we think of, the care that is needed for individuals to supplement family caregivers? So it's one thing to address the needs of caregivers and say, well, take care of yourself. Well, actually, you can only do so much, right? So I think so thank you for your research. It's really interesting. And I look forward to reading more of it.
Thank you very much. I think you bring up a very important point in terms of palliative care. So there are actually different terms of palliative care, right? So palliative can simply just mean that this is, medical interventions are no longer going to happen. So I think with the way things are going right now in terms of wanting to keep people at home for the longest we can, we need to uphold with the care that's being provided, right? There seems to be a gap in that as well. And there are only so many things or so many provisions that a care partner can provide for their partners. It takes such an emotional toll to look after somebody who has very high needs at home. And essentially, if the care providers or the caregivers, care partners are not able to look after themselves, it's going to be very difficult for them to look after their partners at home. So there is that gap as well in that sense from the medical perspective that absolutely would need to be addressed, I think, as well from a research perspective. But there are a lot of things now that are coming up that I feel like we're on the right track to get there, but it's really implementing some change from a clinical perspective, but also a medical perspective would be incredibly helpful for this population.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? I see that we have several people here, some of whom might have responded perhaps through the Parkinson's Society. I know that also the information was sent out through the Council on Aging. And so how might this connect, you can say, with your own sensitivity to particular issues that Andrea has brought up?